We live in a day where we come across some wild headlines. Would you agree? Here's some wild headlines. Believers now a minority in society. Antagonists declare death to religion. Foreign foes set their sights on Jerusalem. Morality mocked by national leaders. Faith-based values targeted by political agenda. These are the types of disturbing headlines that are becoming more common in our society. These are the days of cultural shift. These are the days of increasingly hostility toward God and His people and the decline of morality and truth. These are the days where good is called evil and evil is called good. I believe that these are the days of Daniel. Now, you may assume that I took those headlines that I just read from the news outlets of our day. It sounds like things that we see, right? But actually, I got them from the headlines of 2,500 years ago. 605 BC to be exact. These were the things that are spoken about in the book of Daniel in Babylon. And we're going to find that the book of Daniel is as relevant today as the news cycles that we see. Now, to appreciate the book of Daniel, you need to understand we as Christians, in a lot of ways, are living in a Babylonian exile. When we become believers, our citizenship is transferred from this world to heaven. We become citizens of heaven, which means we become ambassadors to the world that we dwell in. Living in a culture that does not share the same moral values as what the Lord has established, where idol worship is rampant. Now, the dictator that tries to enslave us may not be King Nebuchadnezzar, as we're going to be seeing in just a moment, but the devil himself, he has plans to change identities, to change the object of our worship, and we'll discover this in a few moments. So how do we respond? How do we respond in a culture that is becoming hostile about God and the people of God? Aren't you glad you came to church? Aren't we excited? Today we're starting a brand new series. And we're calling it Stand. And we're going to be looking at the life of Daniel and his buddies, and we're going to see how they stood in the Babylonian culture and glean and take things from them so that we can learn how to stand in our culture. Because Romans 12:2 says this. I'm reading from the Message paraphrase on this verse. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit in it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what He wants to do from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you, always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings the best out of you, develops well-formed maturity in you. Daniel is living proof that one can maintain faith in a society that does not share the same faith or even opposes the faith that Daniel had. If you have your Bibles, turn to Daniel chapter 1. And that's where we'll be camping out today. Today I want to lay some background and some foundations to help us carry through the weeks to come. Here's some background. Israel. At this point in time, where we see the story of Daniel is after King David and King Solomon. There was a period of time where there were some wicked kings in Israel, to the point where Israel split in two, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom was made up of 10 tribes of Israel. The bottom two was the tribe Judah and Benjamin. This was the kingdom that Daniel and his 3 buddies were a part of. Now, just like the northern kingdom, a couple years before this, the Assyrians came into the northern kingdom and completely just wreaked havoc, just destroyed and put into captivity the people of the northern tribes. Well, one of the reasons why it's discovered in 2 Kings is that this was something the prophets told the people of Israel. If you turn against God, if you keep rebelling against God, if you keep worshiping idols and rejecting God's way, He's going to take you to the woodshed. And one of the ways that He's going to do it, He's going to actually allow pagan countries to come in and wage war and take over. That happens to the northern kingdom. Southern kingdom doesn't seem like they learned a lot of lessons from what happened to the northern kingdom, so they start falling into idol worship, and they start turning away from the things of God and getting so acclimated to pagan worship that Jeremiah said, the Babylonians are coming. And they did. 605. Actually, they did 3 campaigns into the southern kingdom and into Jerusalem. And what ended up happening is they came in and they ransacked Jerusalem. Not only that, they went into the temple and they trashed all of the sacred worship things, and then they took the real precious ones, the ones of gold and the ones that were really used for the sacred worship of Yahweh, and they took it back to Babylon and stuck it into the treasure house to use it for their pagan worship. Then they burnt the temple down completely. And there, just a couple years ago, they excavated the temple, the old temple, the first temple, and they could see on the foundations scorched marks, so they know that it was true what happened. Then what they did, the Babylonians took the royals and the nobility, the boys that were the cream of the crop, if you will, and they took them, and these boys were at the age between 12 and 15. And they cart them 1,000 miles away from their home. Think about that. Think about that. Junior high, early high school, boys being ripped from their homes. Everything that they knew. their parents, their religion, everything, sent 1,000 miles away from home. King Nebuchadnezzar issued this. He was cruel. He was the Babylonian king, emperor, if you will, because he conquered Assyria, the ones that just took over the northern, and he was going and he was taking names and he was just ruthless. These boys are scared and intimidated, and rightfully so. And that's where we pick up the story of Daniel in chapter 1, verse 3. Here we go. Then the king, King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, the king ordered Ashpenaz, his chief of staff, to bring to the palace some of the young men of Judah's royal family and other noble families who had been brought to Babylon as captives. Select, the king says, select only strong, healthy, and good-looking young men. Make sure that they are well-versed in every branch of learning and gifted with knowledge and good judgment and are suited to serve in the royal palace. Train these young men in the language and literature of Babylon. In other words, I want them to speak the way that we speak, and I want them to think the way that we think. Brainwashing. Brainwash these boys. Everything that they've learned growing up, I want you to challenge them in that and replace it with Babylonian culture and knowledge. This was a very intentional and strategic plan to indoctrinate these young boys into the Babylonian culture. Basically, it was a 3-year graduate course to replace everything they had learned growing up, brainwashing them with these new ideas. I'm just going to be blunt. A lot of what Christians are experiencing now going off to secular universities is exactly what's happening to them. Things that they grew up in faith are being challenged and replaced. So how did the Babylonians start this process of indoctrination? Let's look at it. Verse 5. The king assigned them a daily ration of food and wine from their own kitchens. And they were to be trained for 3 years, and then they would enter the royal service. Verse 6. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were 4 of the young men chosen, all from the tribe of Judah. The chief of staff renamed them with these Babylonian names. Daniel was called Belshazzar. Hananiah was called, we now know these, Shadrach. Mishael was called Meshach. And Azariah was called Abednego. They were stripped of their identities. And the kings wanted their names to be changed. Why? Because their original names were all tied to the worship of Yahweh. If you look at the meanings of their names, it refers to Yahweh, the one true God. And the new names that they were given all represented the Babylonian culture and or the pagan gods they worshipped. For example, Azariah. Azariah, his name means Yahweh has helped. They changed it to Abednego, which means servant of Nebo. Abednego. He was a pagan god. The god they had pagan gods for everything, and actually it was not the god of sun, but the god of light. That was his name. Abednego, servant of light. So essentially, every time somebody would call them by their new names, it was a reminder that they are no longer Hebrew. And the Babylonian, they're Babylonians now. And they are not to serve Yahweh, the one true God, but they are going or expected to serve the pagan gods. And this is how they did it. They changed their diet. You're like, how? What? Did you notice in the verse they were to eat from the king's table? The king's table had the best meal. Now you're thinking, woo, prime rib, T-bone, have at it. Yeah! Seconds, please. The problem was the food that was prepared for the king, the meat and the wines, it was first dedicated to the pagan gods. Listen, this is very important. To eat the food meant that you embrace the faith of the pagan gods. What you ate in that culture, even the Jewish culture, what you ate was significant to your faith. We don't really think about that right now. I mean, we slap hot dogs and everything. No, a good Jew, you did not. You had a strict diet that you ate because it reflected how you honored God. So by changing their diet and eating all this stuff, you embrace the faith of the pagan gods. This created a real problem for Daniel and his friends because they wanted to honor and to worship Yahweh. And one of the ways that they did was observing a certain diet. So compromising starts with small little things. See, one of the ways that the culture indoctrinates people is not with these huge, great, big ideas. It's these little compromising ideas that build on each other. And that's the same strategy of our spiritual enemy. If you have your bulletins, you can fill this in. The goal of the devil is to change who we are and whose we are. That is the goal of the devil for us, point blank. To steal, to kill, to destroy. To steal, to kill, and destroy what? Our identity and our object of worship. By assimilating us in such a way to change our identities and the object of our worship. Anything but the one true God. We are in spiritual Babylon. Yes, our culture, our society does a lot of good things. But hear the dialogue of our nation. People fighting about the state of our foundation. The men who were the founders of this country. Textbooks being rewritten. So how do we respond as Christians, as exiles in a foreign land? Remember, we're citizens. If you're a Christian, your citizenship is in heaven. How do we stand for God and protect our identities? Who we are and whose we are. Daniel and his 3 friends are going to show us. Look at this. This is great. Verse 8. But Daniel resolved, the New King James actually says, purposed in his heart. So Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. What does defile mean? The dictionary says to defile is to taint, corrupt, or pollute. So, Daniel resolved not to corrupt himself with royal food and wine. And he asked the chief official for permission not to pollute himself in this way. You can write this down. Daniel made a predetermined decision. How do we respond? One of the ways is that we can make a predetermined decision. Before the temptation, before the things that come up in our society that are against God, before the temptation was even there, he had decided, he resolved, it says, in advance what he would do and what he would not do. And he decided that he had to make a decision. And that's why he was so successful. See, it would have been easier for Daniel and his 3 buddies to give in. They were just kids, right? They were just kids. And many of them who were also in captivity gave in. Gave in to the food, gave in embracing the name. Yet Daniel resolved not to defile himself so he could honor God. Pastor Chris Hodgins down in Alabama, he wrote a book called The Daniel Dilemma. It's a great book. And he wrote this in his book. Convictions are all about the choices we make before we're challenged. Faith is our ability to act on our convictions when tested. Church, we need to decide today where we stand before we are truly tested, because you will be tested. It's already happening. Decide today whether you're going to stand on the truth of what God's Word says, or the deceptions of the culture, or the feelings of the culture as it's placed and put. Issues like marriage, family, morality, truth. We live in a culture that is lying to us and trying to redefine what God has established, compromising the truth because of feelings. You see this all the time now on when people post something online or on the news. I was offended. They made me feel. Has no relevance to truth. It is all about feelings. And majority of the times, those feelings do not honor God. Decide where you stand so that you can have a faith to stand when it's truly tested. Daniel was determined not to defile himself by eating the food and wine given to him by the king, but to stay loyal to God. So he asked the chief of the staff for permission not to eat this unacceptable food. When you live in that way, when you decide in your heart, I will not do that because it dishonors God. It kind of reminds me of what Chick-fil-A did a couple years ago. Remember this? The whole stance on marriage, man and woman. Man, they said that, you would think somebody cut off their kid's head. People, boycott Chick-fil-A! Boycott Chick-fil-A! Because they said marriage is about a man and a woman. Well, the Christians and the Christian community and others outside of Christianity said, no, I think this is right. So they went ahead and they, instead of boycotting against, they boycotted for Chick-fil-A. I don't know if you knew this, but in one weekend, they made more money than most restaurants did in a whole year. And we're going to see why that is in just a second. Because when you're loyal to God, you can write this down. God will honor loyalty. Have many faces with this, but God will honor loyalty. And I believe he honored Chick-fil-A for standing up what he has had established from the beginning. Marriage is between a man and a woman. God will honor loyalty. Look what he does for Daniel and his buddies. Verse 9. Now God had given the chief of staff both respect and affection for Daniel. Who gave it? Who gave the chief of staff affection for Daniel? God did. God will honor loyalty. Verse 10. But he responded, I am afraid of my Lord and King, who has ordered that you eat the food and wine. If you become pale and thin compared to the other youths your age, I'm afraid the king will have me beheaded. Watch the wisdom of Daniel, which I also believe was an honor of God. Verse 11, Daniel spoke with the attendant who had been appointed by the chief of staff to look after Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azrael. This is what Daniel says. Please test me for 10 days on a diet of vegetables and water, Daniel said. And at the end of the 10 days, see how we look compared to the other young men who are eating the king's food. Look at this. Then make your decision in light of what you see. That's diplomacy. Daniel did not make any demands. He did not stomp his foot pouting, I don't want to eat that. Right? He didn't throw a temper tantrum. Church, belly aching is not a spiritual gift. Instead of belly aching or complaining or demanding, try being the Daniels of this generation. Try diplomacy. Try using wisdom from God by the way that you live and the way that you speak. Daniel trusted God and just posed a respectful idea. Put it to the test, he said. They eat that food, we eat this food, and after 10 days, you decide the outcome. Verse 14. The attendant agreed to Daniel's suggestion and tested them for 10 days. Pause. Do you realize what Daniel just did? He influenced to reverse the attended indoctrination. They wanted him to worship the pagan gods. The chief of staff, he says, it's okay to go ahead and worship your God, Yahweh. That's basically what he's saying, without saying it. Verse 15. At the end of the 10 days, Daniel and his 3 friends looked healthier and better nourished than the young men who had been eating the food assigned by the king. I love this. So after that, the attendant fed them only vegetables instead of the food and wine provided for the others. In other words, they didn't have to embrace the faith of the pagan gods of Babylon. When we decide to honor God, God will show favor. When we honor God, God will show and provide favor. Verse 17, God gave these 4 young men, and here's another loyalty, if you will, of favor. God gave these 4 young men an unusual aptitude for understanding every aspect of literature and wisdom. Pause. What was the wisdom? It's kind of weird how we can think of this, but God actually allowed them to grab a hold of the pagan culture, the wisdom of it. But I'm sure that there was a wisdom in it about how to use it without believing it. Makes sense? But also look what he does with Daniel. And God gave Daniel the special ability to interpret the meanings of visions and dreams, which will become very handy in the next couple weeks. Verse 18, when the training period ordered by the king was complete, 3 years, the chief of staff brought all the young men to King Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them, and no one impressed him as much as Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the royal service. Who were they worshiping? The one true God, Yahweh. Yet, what did God do with them? Place them in the highest position to influence. Verse 20. Whenever the king consulted them in any manner, requiring wisdom and balanced judgment, he found them 10 times more capable than any of the magicians, enchanters in the entire kingdom, which will prove to be problematic for those boys in the future. But still, verse 21, Daniel remained in the royal service until the first year of the reign of King Cyrus. Daniel and his friends, primarily Daniel, lived in a pagan culture, but was not defined by it. He stood firm in his faith and stood out through his character and conduct. And by honoring God, God honored him. God blessed Daniel with influence that spanned 80 years in Babylon. A prisoner of war, mind you. Yet by the end of his 80 years in Babylon, listen to this, Daniel had counseled 4 different administrations of government. In other words, he was lead counsel for 4 kings. In a pagan culture, he directed and influenced policy, led 3 revivals. He also was made chief magi. If you know anything, every Christmas we hear, "We 3 kings of Oriental," right? Why were they looking for stars? The King of Kings, the King of the Jews. It's because Daniel's the one that taught them or passed it down to them. He was the chief magi of that priestly caste that followed the star. It was Daniel that influenced without compromising his faith or diluting his character. We can learn a lot from Daniel. So does this mean that if you honor God, God's going to place you in the White House or the courthouse or the Pentagon or the State House? I don't know. But perhaps by honoring God in your house, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. That will influence your generation, the children, and perhaps your child will be the one that makes the difference in a community, in a state, in a nation, maybe even the world. We can learn a lot from Daniel. Primarily, you can fill this in. How to stand out in faith by the way you live. It's the simple things. It's the simple things that make the big difference. It's the things that you do as a family. We won't say this, we won't do this. That will create an environment that can and will, most likely, if you're honoring God, will become countercultural. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. To serve the Lord in some ways, in a lot of ways, means that you will not blend in. And that terrifies some of you. I realize that. But Jesus calls us to be different. To be set apart. That's what holy means. Be holy as I am holy, Jesus says. And when you don't blend in or go along, sometimes when you stand out in faith, you will face challenges. Jesus promised that. But be encouraged. Greater is he that is in you than he that is in the world. Here's my challenge for us. I saw this analogy and I thought this was really good. It made me think. You can either be a thermometer or a thermostat. You're like, what? Think about it. A thermometer only gauges what's going on around them and reflects that. If it's hot, it adapts to that. If it's cool, it adapts to that. Everything that happens in culture, if you're a thermometer, you're going to fit in and adjust to that culture. Or you can be a thermostat. What does a thermostat do? It's the one that influences and regulates the temperature. It's the agent of change and of influence. So my question to us, are we going to be thermometers or thermostats? Daniel was a thermostat. And like the prophet Daniel, we can be people of influence by simply standing on the promises of God. By resolving, this is what the Word of God says. I'm going to do that. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stand in honor of God. We can be people who reflect the loving kindness of a good God. Because God is good. He's loving. He's merciful. And we need to be that as well. But at the same time, stand firm in the truth of a righteous God. There are standards. You don't do this, you do this. And that will set us apart. I started with Romans 12, verse 2. I want to back it up one verse and finish that verse again as we close. So here's what I want you to do, God helping you. Take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for Him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God, and you'll be changed from the inside out. Stand out in faith by the way that you live, and do it for the glory of God. And in the coming weeks, we'll discover more how to do that. Amen?